Hey guys, Josh here, and in this video I'm going to look at how the AMD HD7950, a 4-year-old video card, performs in recent graphically demanding games at maximum settings and compare it to the much more recent R9 390. So let's get straight into it and take a look at the cards I'll be testing today. Representing the 7950, I have an HIS ICQ model, factory overclocked to 925 MHz on the core, with a reference memory clock speed of 1250 MHz. I managed to achieve 1050 MHz on the core and 1500 MHz on the memory at stock voltage, but increasing the speed more than that resulted in driver crashes in game. My 390 is an MSI twin Frozer card, factory overclocked to 1040 MHz with a memory speed of 1500 MHz. Unfortunately, I got a bit unlucky with my card, and any overclocking resulted in artifacting in games, so I left the card at its factory overclocked speeds for my benchmarks. Speaking of the benchmarks, I ran all of the tests at 1080p with all the settings maxed to keep things equal between runs. The games I tested were GTA 5, which due to its very extensive list of settings is pretty hard to run with all of them maxed out. Crysis III, a game that came out 3 years ago but is still very well known for pushing GPUs to their limits. Star Wars Battlefront, which runs on the same Frostbite 3 engine that the upcoming Battlefield 1 will run on, so should give us a reasonably good indication of how that will run when it releases later this year, and Assetto Corsa, which just like GTA 5 has a very expansive settings menu with lots of demanding settings, resulting in a very GPU intensive game when it's maxed out. I also ran 3D Mark Firestrike at 1080p to see how far apart the cards were in a synthetic benchmark. So let's start with GTA 5, which I ran with everything set to very high, with softest shadows, FXAA switched on, and no MSAA. It's worth noting that I didn't change anything in the advanced graphics section of the settings menu, since those options are really only designed for the highest end PCs to be able to run. I recorded frame rates in both the city, where it tends to run slightly faster than average, and in the swamp just south of the military base to stress the cards with lots of densely packed tall grass and trees. As the graph shows, the 7950 put in a respectable performance with minimum frame rates above 30 FPS, but the 390 really showed its power, beating out the older card by a big margin. Moving on to Crysis III, a game known for being very intensive on the GPU, we see that with very high texture quality and very high system spec, the minimum frame rate stays above 30 on the 7950, but the game is much more playable on the 390, which barely dropped below 60 FPS during the first cutscene inside the Liberty Dome, which is what I was using for my frame rate testing. Next we have Star Wars Battlefront, which isn't as hard to run as the other games in this test, but due to running on the same Frostbite 3 engine, it may have similar performance to the upcoming Battlefield 1. At ultra settings, the 7950 mustered a very playable 53 FPS average, but the 390 walked away with this one, averaging over 100 FPS with a minimum of 81 while playing on the Endor map. The last game in the testing suite was Assetto Corsa, which I found to be more demanding than any of my other games with all the settings maxed. This was the only game where the 7950 fell short of 30 FPS on the minimum frame rate, and even my 390 struggled a little bit with a maximum of only 80 FPS, the only maximum below 100 in all of these games for the 390. However, it still provided very smooth gameplay with a minimum just under the magic 60 FPS mark of 55 frames per second. Finally, I ran the cards through the 3D Mark Firestrike benchmark to see what the performance difference between them was in a synthetic benchmark, and here we can see that the 390 scored almost twice as many points in the graphics benchmark as the 390, with nearly 12,000 compared to just under 7,000 for that 390. So unsurprisingly, the 7950 is a sizable chunk slower than the 390 with all the settings maxed out, but expecting a 4-year-old GPU to run games maxed out at 1080p 60 FPS seems a little bit unreasonable, so I dropped the settings down to high in all of my games and ran the benchmarks again to see if I could achieve a 60 FPS average. As you can see from these charts, running at high settings allowed the 7950 to increase its average frame rate to around the 60 FPS mark, with minimums ranging from around 40 to 50 FPS depending on the game, a much more playable frame rate. So based on these numbers, the 7950 is still a very capable 1080p gaming card, and with their used price being so much lower than the newer cards, I picked mine up for £90 including shipping on eBay, they massively outperform the newer stuff when it comes to price to performance. Obviously buying used isn't something everyone feels comfortable with, so it's good to see that buying a much more recent card new will still give you better overall performance even if the price to performance isn't quite as good. So anyway, thanks a lot for checking this video out guys, and let me know, were you expecting the 7950 to be as competitive as it is? Are you considering picking one up for a more inexpensive build, or are you more interested in the new Pascal and Polaris stuff that's coming out from Nvidia and AMD? Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next one.